Good morning to all. The reality is that if I didn't say a few words about why this day is a very special day for Argentina and a day of great joy, I would be a hypocrite. It took me a few minutes to arrive. I apologize because I was meeting with the CEO of PHEF. This giant who is Horacio Marin, and it delayed that we have one Woodford in the United States.
Y la demora obedeció a que le hemos ganado a Woodford en Estados Unidos.
Thank you to the management of Horacio at YPF and the entire team of lawyers.
Gracias a la gestión de Horacio en YPF y todo el equipo de abogados.
Let's say in particular the prosecution, we have achieved that Argentina has to
Hemos logrado que Argentina tenga que
avoid the payment of $18 billion.
18.000 millones de dólares.
And as I am my law, I'm going to say in a style of my law, we have to come and fix the shits that are useless, stupid, incompetent que se lofted during the second government of corruption and preside over Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And now come and say, but the trips from my law to the United States. But the May Macau, but the management, here is the management, $18 billion. In the first place, I want to thank our minister, Santo Petroverlo.
En primer lugar, quiero agradecerle a nuestra ministra Sandra Petroverlo
for leading this initiative and for fighting tirelessly to develop human capital in our country. This is a double recognition for Sandra. When we started the management, you already know that when I take my glasses off, it is the unstable part of the speeches. You can expect anything. When we started the management, without a doubt,
cuando nosotros iniciamos la gestión, sin lugar a dudas,
the most clumsy minister, the most questioned, the most operated, the most polluted by the overflowing corrupt media in Argentina was precisely the minister Sandra Petroverlo. For something that is incredible, that is, they dirtied her and operated her for being honest. For cutting the work of the intermediaries of poverty, for cutting the work of the managers of poverty, in addition, along with the enormous task of today's national senator for the autonomous city of Buenos Aires and then Minister of Security, Dr. Boric, not only faced the mafia delinquents who appropriated money from the vulnerable, but also used that money that they stole to extort people and make them leave. We now have 9,000 piques a year as zero, and that is thanks to the management of Dr. Boric and the management of Minister Sandra Petroverlo. Thank you. So, Manuel, at some point later it will be your turn to thank you.
Así que Manuel en algún momento después va a tocar darte las gracias.
Also, I want to thank the companies and organizations that are present and that Sandra already mentioned. If you had read a little slower, we would applaud everything, but you are like accelerated. The reality is you are protagonists and pioneers of this initiative that has a lot to offer to the country. The history of this building is interesting. What was once a home for children was co-opted during the Kirchnerismo by eco-tourist organizations entrenched in social development. They used it for militant activities and they literally left it in ruins. That is what the Kirchnerismo does. With the resources of the state, it turns them into a war bow for its organizations, parasitizes them and leaves them in ruins. Today, this place is again what it should always be. A place that allows Argentines to grow, a place that you take them out of dependence instead of putting them in it. Because ultimately it is the core of their model. They need that Argentines do not believe in themselves. They need to resign their values, to resign their pride and kneel forever before the State Diva. And so for decades, Argentine society was taught that the most that a person could aspire to was to work in the state, that the state was the redeemer, that the state was the one who gave, the one who protected, the one who resolved. And when the state did not reach, the social plans appeared as a substitute. The result is known. 2 out of every 3 children were poor. The formal private job had not grown for 15 years, and little more than half of the population was below the poverty line. In addition, they generated such a disaster, and some are forgotten, but 30% of the former workers were poor. That was what the Kirchnerismo left. That is not an accident. That is the inevitable consequence of a system that replaced work for the diva and freedom for defendants. And the serious thing about its perversity is that they do not believe that it is something negative. They believe that a whole life subdued by other people's will is desirable, especially if they are the ones who handle the levers. We flatly reject that maximum, but that is not why we neglect the most vulnerable. On the contrary, we understand that decades of populism and clientelism left society impoverished and dependent, and that cutting from the beginning with social assistance would only generate a humanitarian crisis that would be unfair in itself. In fact, when we were thinking with Sandra, let's say the idea of the Ministry of Human Capital back in 2022, one of the things that came out clearly was what Ayn Rand called the ethics of the emergency. That is, we as libertarians understand perfectly that these aids are financed with taxes. But we also understand that the most vulnerable sectors have been victims of a situation of high expropriation by corrupt politicians, businessmen, foremen, accomplished journalists who set up a corporate Argentina that the consequence was to leave a tendril of poor people and that one could knock up that situation because it was also unfair for these people, and that the answer was to change the logic. As social policy, it was for people to stop waiting for fish and start going out to fish, and with that, let's say, it is the idea of human capital. Now, in a few lines later, I am going to make some reflections on human capital, but also what must be understood is that the end of assistance is to accompany those who are on their knees so that they can join themselves, so that they can walk with their own feet and do not have to ask anyone in the future to be fine, so that they can form a family and educate as it seems best within the framework of the common law. But to be able to achieve it was not enough exclusively with giving money or fruit. You have to proverbially teach to fish, and that is something that Sandra has more than clear. In that sense, the Human Capital Ministry is not a bureaucratic name, it is a declaration of principles. We know if empirical evidence shows that human capital explains about 70 percentage points of long-term economic growth. This is the reason why this ministry exists, not to distribute plans, but to build the conditions that make Argentines able to grow.
argentinos puedan crecer.
The truth is that the foundation of this ministry, without a doubt, is a tribute to Gary Becker.
El fundamento, digamos, la verdad que el fundamento de este ministerio, sin lugar a dudas, es un tributo a Gary Becker.
So that you have an idea of the admiration that I have for Gary Becker in a time that I lived in the bust until I had to throw the wall because of the arrival of my little children, who needed more space. I had a frame of 1.5 meters by 1 meter of Gary Becker, deriving the equation of intertemporal Lasky, that is, how the pattern of consumption is modified. The 4 changes in the interest rate, to put this in Spanish. So let's say it is someone who in fact, I have all the books of Gary Becker, and the interesting thing is that had the idea of human capital appeared. The idea of human capital as a result of Robert Solo trying to test his development model developed in 1956. He tested it in 1957 and can only explain 15% of economic growth. The answer to the empirical precariousness of the results, the answer of the one who managed the Department of Economy of the University of Chicago, which was George Stigler. I told Salo, your problem is that you do not incorporate human capital. And from there, 2 lines of research on human capital are developed. The line of human capital in microeconomics developed by Gary Becker, and then God ends, in fact, by presenting a book called Human Capital. Then I am going to make a reference to how this place is designed and why it keeps a deep relationship with it. Theory of human capital of Gary Becker. This seemed like a political discourse because it became a technical discourse. I do not know what the Antiochians are, but as I'm talking about the Antiochians, they imagine that it is more or less the same. And then in the line of macro dynamic, that is, economic growth, Jeremy Mizo incorporates human capital in economic growth models. It is not a minor issue. Jeremy Mizo was also the tutor of thesis, probably the best Argentine economist in all history, who was Miguel Sidrowski. Let's say that he is known and he jumped to fame for incorporating money into economic growth models. However, the profession decided to go the other way. It decided to put technological progress in an exogenous way, something like that. It was, and the literature of economic growth narrowed down, let's say, and back in the 70s it was absolutely stagnant. Let's say it was on its way to extinction. Robert Lucas Jr., who had, let's say, had already become extremely well known with rational expectations, had started to ask, let's say, okay, this meaningless debate with which he initiated itself was finished. He said, but here the important thing is growth. So he began to explore, let's say, economic growth, and there, by the year 83, a mathematician also at the University of Chicago, Paul Rimmer, develops the first endogenous growth model, let's say. He has made an endogenous growth model based on human capital, based on creative destruction. And let's say in the year 85, let's say Robert Lucas Jr., who is the tutor of thesis of Paul Rimmer, basically in the readings Lionel Robbins goes and explains the role of human capital in economic growth. Onco, that generates a whole series of debates, and that debate technically concludes in the year 1989 with an article by Gregory Mankiw, David Rimmer, not Paul Romer, David Romer, yes, and David Quayle, who what they do is test economic growth
lo que hacen es testear el crecimiento económico.
Incorporating human capital and explaining 15%. The incorporation of human capital
La incorporación del capital humano
makes the explanation jump to 85%. They said, okay, the question is over. Let's say what
digamos, lo que
the economic growth generates is human capital, and that is the concept that is behind
está detrás
the design of our human capital ministry. Human capital is what generates growth, and
humano es lo que genera crecimiento. Y
if
si
we want to
queremos
make
hacer
Argentina
realidad
great again, we
la
need human capital for
necesitamos capital humano para
that
ese
challenge, and that is what we are asking ourselves, and that is what we are doing. Regarding what human capital is from the microeconomic perspective, it has two
Desde la perspectiva micro, o sea, microeconómica, tiene dos
dimensions. The first has to do with the health and foods of children. If a child
alimentación de los chicos. Si un niño
does not develop well in his early years, then it is very difficult to recover that time. That is why we duplicate the universal assignment by child and strengthen the plan 1,000 days. But the second dimension, that is, this is called human capital of the first generation. That is to say that the children are formed and that they are healthy so that they can enter this study to graduate and to be able to work, which is the human capital of the second generation. The second dimension then is the one that brings us here today. It has to do with education and with labor association, with which Argentines can learn to train and enter the labor market. For generations, this country taught that the army truly worthy person was the one who came with the university title. Thus, the university education was fetishized, and the jobs were despised. Card, being a doctor, being a lawyer, an engineer, a physicist, a mathematician, an economist are valuable professors, valuable professions. But there are many other professions that are also valuable and that are precisely the ones that today are scarce, such as being an electrician, a plumber or welder or refrigeration technician. Today, we have a labor market where companies look for trained staff in different types of jobs, and they do not find them. At the same time, we have young people who want to work. They cannot certify that they know how to do something, or they do not find work related to what they study. In Argentina today, a plumber, in fact, earns more than someone who has just received, and that is because the market recognizes what is scarce and what it needs. That is to say, it is the signal of prices. That is, there is a clear shortage of jobs, and what is scarce are the hands that know how to do things and solve problems for the next one. And here is the heart of what we are doing. This project, driven by human capital, is an example of when incentives are put in order. The private sector in itself seeks to generate employment and develop the capacities of Argentines. Thus, center works with a simple and opposed logic to that of Chaiserism. It is not the states that decides what is taught, it is the companies, because the companies are the ones that hire, the ones that know what they need, and the ones that pay the salaries. The private finances, the private funds, the private employees, the state puts the frame, given the space, and runs away from the middle. This part, this definition, and the way in which the center is built here is also a tribute to Gary Becker. When you study Gary Becker's book, Human Capital, what Gary Becker points out is that there are two types of training. There is general training and specific training. When you have a company and you train, you do not give general training. It is an obvious matter of incentives. That is, if you give general training, you are investing and you will not be able to benefit from that increase. Let's say from the skills of the person, because that person takes the training and can go to work elsewhere. So companies do not give general training. What do?
¿Qué es lo que hacen?
specific training,
Formación
and that is what makes you increase
Y
productivity,
eso es lo que hace que ustedes aumenten la productividad,
be valuable to
sean
companies, and that
valiosos
generates
para
two
las
very
empresas,
important
y
situations,
eso genera
because
dos situaciones muy importantes. Porque
as the company
como
has
la
to be investing
empresa,
in forming that human capital, the
tiene que
company
estar
then takes care
invirtiendo en
of
formar ese capital humano, la empresa después cuida
those
esos
jobs with
empleos
nails
con
and
un día
teeth because it is
siguiente,
taking care of
porque
the
está
investment it made.
cuidando la
That
inversión que
is,
hizo. Es decir,
that
esa
association between
asociación
workers and non-entrepreneurs
entre
becomes much stronger,
trabajadores y empresarios se hace muchísimo más fuerte, por más
even
que
if
los
the
marxistas
Marxists
no
do
la
not
quieran
want to
ver.
see it. So that generates a virtuous
Entonces,
association that,
eso genera una asociación virtuosa que
in
además
addition, strengthens
potencia
growth
el
through greater
crecimiento y
productivity and
además la
improves
productividad y mejora la
constructions
condiciones
of
de vida
life
de
of
los
human
seres humanos,
beings, because
porque la
greater
mayor
productivity
productividad
also involves high
implica también salarios más altos.
salaries. Therefore, this is not merely a
Por tanto, esto
project.
no es meramente
This
un
is already
proyecto.
working.
Esto ya está
Metrog is
funcionando. Metrogas ya
already trained
capacitó
gases.
gasistas.
Sintepl already trained
Metrobras ya
painters.
formó
Fekov
pintores.
already worked with his
Fekova ya
companies.
trabajó con sus empresas.
There are
Ya
already
hay
diplomas
diplomas
delivered.
instaurados.
The batch
El
kills the
dato
batch.
mata al relato.
And I want to explain something that is
Quiero explicar
equally
algo que es igualmente
important.
importante.
We are reconverting plans into work. And many
Estamos
say we do
reconvirtiendo
it.
los planes en trabajo. Digo, muchos lo decían, nosotros lo hacemos. Digo,
There are
eso
many
es
very nice
o sea,
slogans.
hay muchos
We say them better
eslogans muy
because we
lindos.
know what we are talking about.
Nosotros los decimos mejor porque sabemos de qué estamos hablando.
But we also
Además
did.
lo hacemos.
The people who receive the plan to return to work will be able to access,
Volver al trabajo van a poder acceder,
if they
si así
wanted
lo
to, a
quisieran,
training
a
to
una
reintegrate into the
capacitación
labor
para
market.
reinsertarse en el mercado laboral.
The Kusores will
El
also
kirchnerismo
ask for a
también pedía una
counterpayment, but the plans,
contraprestación, pero los planes,
but the
pero la
counterpayment was to
contraprestación
go on.
era para ir a una
That is,
marcha.
after so long that
Es
it was
decir,
declared
después de tanto tiempo que se declamó
that in
que en
reality the plan
realidad
should be
los
to reinsert
planes
people into the labor
deberían
market and
ser
that nobody
para
did anything.
reinsertar la gente al mercado laboral y que nadie hizo nada.
The ones who are doing it are us. Thank you, Sandra. In short, this is not just an administrative change, it is a change of conception. The state no longer
Esto no es solo un cambio administrativo, es un cambio de concepción. El Estado ya no le da
gives
a la
people a
gente
plan
un
to
plan para
stay.
que se
It gives them
quede,
a tool so that they
una
can grow for
herramienta para
themselves
que
in
pueda crecer por sí misma en la
life,
vida,
so that they
para
can
que se
integrate
integre al
into the
mercado,
market,
para que
so that they
trabaje,
can work,
para que
because work
porque el trabajo
dignifies,
dignifica y
and
la
age
dádiva
perpetuates
perpetúa la
poverty.
pobreza.
The Argentina that we are
Argentina que
building is
estamos
going to need a
construyendo va a
lot of
necesitar mucha gente
trained people.
capacitada.
We have
Tenemos
investments for
inversiones
more
por
than
más de
$100
$100
billion
billones
announced.
anunciadas.
Cattle,
Vaca muerta,
mining industry,
minería,
nuclear energy,
energía nuclear,
agro-industry,
agroindustria,
technology, all that
tecnología,
generates
todo eso genera
work,
trabajo.
but it generates work
Genera
for people
trabajo
who
para
know how to
personas
do
que sepan
things.
hacer cosas.
The question is now,
El interrogante no es
if
si
there
va a
will be
haber
work in
trabajo en Argentina.
Argentina, the question
El
is whether the
interrogante es si los
Argentines will
argentinos
be
van a estar
prepared
preparados para
to take
tomarlo.
it, because in
Que a
China
su
is the
vez,
multiplication
la
of trained
multiplicación
workers
de
that makes
trabajadores capacitados lo que hace subir
the
el
value of
valor del
employment
empleo.
go up. This center is a
Ese centro es
fundamental
una
piece
pieza
to begin to
fundamental
answer
para comenzar a responder esta
this
pregunta.
question, and we are
Estamos
convinced that the
convencidos
answer
que la
will be
respuesta
yes.
será sí.
What we inaugurate here
Lo que hoy inauguramos acá,
in the higher
en
no
la
part
parte
is only a
RAL,
first
es
step.
solamente un primer
We sign
paso.
agreements with more than 10
Firmamos convenios
companies
con más de 10 empresas
operating in the
que operan en el
metropolitan
área
area of
metropolitana de
Buenos Aires, but the model is
El modelo
designed to be
está diseñado
replicated
para replicarse en
throughout
todo
the
el
country
país.
because the
El
problem is not
problema no es
Buenos
de
Aires,
Buenos
it is
Aires, es
Argentine,
Argentina.
and the solution
La
cannot
solución no puede
be
limitarse a
limited
un
to a building.
edificio.
It has to
Tiene que
reach every
llegar a
province,
cada
every
provincia,
city,
cada
every
ciudad,
young
cada
man
joven que
who
quiera
wants to
trabajar,
work, and today
pero
they
no
do
tiene
not
la
have the
herramienta
tool to
para
do it.
hacerlo.
It has to be
Tiene
as
que ser tan
extensive
extensivo
as
como sea
possible.
posible.
That is
Por eso
why I
invito a
invite all
todas
the
las
companies
empresas
and
y
chambers
cámaras que
that want to
quieran
see the
ver al
country
país prosperar
prosper to
a
join this
sumarse a
dream.
este sueño.
Big, medium, or small mining,
Grandes,
cattle,
medianas,
energy
chicas,
producer,
mineras, ganaderas, productoras de energía,
logistics,
logística
or
o
gastronomic,
gastronómicas,
be it urban or
sociedades
rural,
urbanas
any
o
company
rurales,
without
todas
any
empresas sin
distinction
ninguna distinción
can
pueden
join the
sumarse a la
construction of this
construcción de
great
una gran
national job
bolsa de
bag,
trabajo
an
nacional,
initiative that brings
una iniciativa que acerque a
the
los
Argentine
argentinos
dreamers
soñadores
closer to
a las
companies in
empresas
search of
emprendedoras
high-value
buscadoras de
workers,
alto valor humano y
human and
profesional.
professional. And then this
Y
project
luego,
helps. Why
este
not the
proyecto
Argentines
ayude,
to
¿por qué no?,
pursue
a los argentinos a perseguir
their
sus
dreams
sueños
where
en
they
donde
need
más
their
requieran
services
sus
the most.
servicios. El
The
futuro
future
le
belongs to those
pertenece a
who
los que saben
know
hacer
how to do it,
y
and
hoy
today we
acá
begin to form
empezamos
it.
a formarlo.
Before closing the speech, I also want to
Antes
highlight
de cerrar el discurso, también quiero
Something of what Sandra said when she started to walk through this project, that
de lo que comentaba Sandra cuando comenzó a caminar por este
building in
edificio
ruin,
de
and that
ruinas
she did with a Dalmo.
y que lo hacía
There is a
verdadero.
Chinese ideogram that manifests.
Y hay un ideograma chino que manifiesta
The
la
crisis, but he also says that it is an opportunity. It seems something abstract.
Parece algo abstracto.
I'm going to count it with an example that once a German businessman gave me that I thought
Empresario alemán que me pareció
brilliant, a
brillante,
great entrepreneur.
gran emprendedor.
He says that two shoe companies send their
Dice
sales
que,
directors to a very, very, very poor country, to the point that when these two directors arrive,
mandan a
they find that all the people were barefoot.
directores
Obviously, both are in the place, and they
ventas a un país muy pobre. A punto tal que
come back.
cuando
One of them
llegan
says,
los
"No, here you cannot do
vendedores,
anything." The other one
se
says,
encuentran que todas las personas estaban descalzas. Obviamente,
"No, you cannot do anything." The other one says, "No, you cannot do
uno
anything."
de
The
ellos dice, no, acá no
other
se
one
puede
says,
hacer
"No,
nada.
here you cannot do anything. They are all
El
barefoot."
otro dijo, che,
And
acá
the
hay
other
una
one
oportunidad de negocio
said,
enorme, están
"Here
todos
is a
descalzos,
huge
mirá
business
todo lo que tenemos
opportunity.
para
They are all
poner
barefoot. Look at all we have
un par de zapatos".
to put on a pair of shoes,
Y
a
eso
pair of
es
shoes." And that is what the attitude that
la actitud que ha
Sancho and Adelma have manifested when they walk through the ruins of this place,
cuando recorrían las ruinas de este lugar,
which were the ruins of great Argentina. Because when you see the building, it is
de la gran Argentina, porque cuando ustedes ven el edificio,
imposing. It is Argentina that was glorious, brilliant. It is that liberal Argentina that
brillante, esa
became one of the richest countries in the world at the end of the 19th century.
a fines del siglo
That was an admirable country at the beginning of the 20th century until the
a inicios del siglo XX, hasta que nos invadieron los
socialists of different genders with different modalities, therefore taking
Por lo tanto, sacar de las
this building out of the ruins is not just recovering a building, it is working together